I've always wondered what it's like to be on death row. Like, what that actually feels like, knowing your day is coming to an end. Your life is coming to an end. It always kind of haunts me that every single year we pass our death day. Like, that just kind of like scares me, knowing like every single year I pass the day that I'm gonna die. But I have always wondered what it really is like to be on death row. I feel like it must be kind of terrifying a little bit because like you're with all these other people that are like these hardcore criminals, but maybe for some people they just kind of don't care. But for Joe, he liked it. He actually loved being on death row. He was really good friends with all the other inmates and the guards. They were so nice to him, and even the warden was so kind to Joe. Something that Joe had never really experienced his entire life. He just loved it. He had so many cool things. He got really cool food. He had friends. This warden would bring him handmade gifts, homemade snacks, and he even got this battery operated toy train that was like so cool to him. He loved this train. He would play with this train with the other inmates. He would just kind of roll the train between the different cells and they would play with him. He was just safe here. No one was mean to him. He had never really experienced friendship and kindness. When the other inmates and people in general would talk to Joe about death, he'd kind of shrug it off. He'd say things like, I'm not going to die. Joe's not going to die. It was almost like Joe just didn't really understand it. Joe would say things like, they're not going to kill me. It was almost like he knew he was safe from death. But the other inmates, they would try to explain to Joe about death, what will happen. And well, he's on death row and no one makes it out of death row. But it was almost like Joe just didn't understand the concept of death. When the other inmates would talk about how it will work, he's most likely going to fall asleep. Maybe he'll wake up in the most beautiful place ever. And maybe he will have all the toy trains in the world. Maybe he'll even be a conductor. Warden Best had talked to Joe about his execution day. Joe asked if he could just have some ice cream for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And the warden was kind of like, yeah, of course you can. It's your last day. You get to choose. The day Joe would be taken to the holding cell before his execution, he would smile and shake hands with all the other inmates, and he would say things like, I can't wait to be back. As he sat in the holding cell, he had his last bowl of ice cream. When the warden came to take him, Joe said, Hey, is it okay if you can put my ice cream in the fridge? I want to have it when I get back. And it was just like Joe didn't understand, like, he wasn't coming back. Joe just smiled as he walked to the gas chamber with the warden. The warden tried his hardest not to cry in front of Joe. When Joe was placed into the gas chamber, the warden begged and begged, Isn't there something we can do? But they just didn't. Joe would die smiling in the gas chamber on January 6, 1939. He was known as the happiest man on death row. Joe shouldn't have been executed. He shouldn't even been in prison. Joe was 23 going on 6 because Joe was mentally 6 years old. He had an IQ of 46. He was mentally disabled. It would take 72 years until Joe was actually pardoned for the murder and rape of Dorothy Drain. It was a little too late for justice, but at least now his tombstone says, Here lies an innocent man. And this is the story of the happiest man on death row. Hey, welcome to the Decomposing Flower podcast. I'm Jen. With me is Kira. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the happiest man on death row, who was Joe Arridy. Before we begin, I am going to give a little bit of some content warnings. We are going to be talking about murder. There will be a mention of rape. There will be a lot of conversations around ableism, eugenics, and overall abuse towards someone who is mentally disabled. If any of that is too much, feel free to skip out and maybe watch another episode or just take care of yourself, and we'll see you in the next one. A little disclaimer. A lot of this information I found was through the nonprofit called Friends of Joe Arridy, which I think is a really great place to go check out because they give a lot of information on who Joe was. A lot of the people that work on that actually have like connections to the case. It's a really great place to check out all the facts, and that's pretty much where I got a lot of my information and also online. But if anything I say is wrong, feel free to correct me. Everything I say is my own opinion, so if I say something that's not the opinion of the nonprofit or anyone else, but I just wanted to kind of give that little disclaimer. I also want to mention I'm not disabled. And so if I say anything wrong or ignorant or ableist towards the disabled community, please feel free to let us know in the comments. I also want to say that this is a story about someone who was manipulated and abused by the system. And this is not a story about someone's life just being terrible because he was disabled. It's just a story about Joe Arridy who was abused. And we want to share light on this. He was a disabled man. And it's important that we have these conversations surrounding what disabled people go through and how our world is and was really not accessible. And there are still a lot of struggles that people in the disabled community still go through. And this was a case that happened in the 1930s, but ableism is still like very rampant today. But obviously, we are in a better place now. But that being said, I want to say like that someone being disabled does not mean that they have a shitty life, but it's so important that we have an understanding that people who are disabled, and there's nothing wrong with saying that. And if we try to hide from that, we're hiding from the fact that these people do have a disability, and we still need to bring awareness to that and just have these conversations. If we try to
Yeah.
ignore that, it's just taking away what people with disabilities go through. And I'm not going to use the terms differently abled, which I've heard people say, but I know a lot of people in this disabled community hate that because it just takes away what they actually go through. And in this episode, I'm going to try and use a lot of terms that are correct and not outdated because this was an old case. So a lot of the terminology was very outdated, and I don't want to use any words that are incorrect. But again, if I say anything that's ableist or wrong, please feel free to correct me. But with that little intro, I think we can begin. So, Henry and Mary Arty were two Syrian refugees who moved to the United States to Colorado in the early 1910s. They hardly spoke any English. Henry was lucky to find work, and eventually his wife would follow after him, and they would bring three children into their home. Joe Arty was their very first child. He didn't actually speak for 5 years. Even in his adult years, he spoke in very short little sentences, and he only really spoke if he was spoken to. Joe only really attended school for 1 year in elementary until the principal basically expelled him and told his parents that he wasn't allowed back because he couldn't learn. The reason Joe struggled to learn was he was mentally disabled. Now, it's hard to know exactly the reason as to why because I do know in my research, it did say his parents were cousins. Now, I don't know how related of cousins they were. But this also could just be a genetic thing. His brother was also mentally disabled. It also said later that his mom was like simple minded. She also really struggled to speak English. So I don't know if it was just that she didn't speak English very well. And so people just assumed that. But regardless, Joe was someone who was mentally disabled, and his parents kind of tried to do the best that they could. So when Joe stayed back home, he would do a lot of fun things. Like he played with mud, he'd make mud pies, he would wander the town, and he would also hammer nails and just do what kids do. He didn't really talk to a lot of the kids in his neighborhood because no one really talked to him, and he kind of kept up this behavior well into his teen years. When Joe was 10 years old, Henry had actually sent a letter. He got a lot of people in the neighborhood to help him write this letter to find a place for Joe to go to school. And Henry didn't speak really good English and he struggled to write English, but he could read it. But so he had people help him write this letter. Joe would be taken to this school that is no longer functioning. It was a school called Home and Training School for the Mentally Disabled in Grand Junction, Colorado. So when Joe first got there, he had a lot of tests done to him that basically just said he had really concrete thinking and he couldn't think like outside the box. Thoughts of like God, death, like stuff like that just didn't really click for him. He really struggled with that. He couldn't count past 5 without help. He couldn't really name colors or the days of the week. He struggled to know differences between stones and like an egg. So like he was very mentally disabled and just unable to kind of think outside of the box, I guess is the best way to describe it. Henry felt really guilty when his son was there, and I'm not too sure why, but basically he didn't like Joe being there and he got the neighbors to help him write another letter so he could have Joe come back. Unfortunately, a few years later, when Joe was 13 years old, in 1929, Joe was just out walking when a group of boys had come up to him and started picking on him, and they would end up sexually assaulting Joe.
Oh
This
no.
was during a time when Joe's father was in prison for bootlegging. While Joe was being assaulted, a probation officer walked in. Now, instead of this probation officer being like, "Oh my god, this mentally disabled person is being assaulted by a group of boys," this officer was more upset by the fact that these boys were black and that they were boys. So he was really upset by the fact that Joe was what he thought was having consensual sex with black boys. And he thought I don't even know how he thought Joe was having consensual sex because there's no way you would think that. And so this guy was like, "Oh my god, I can't believe this is happening. This is so wrong." And so he ended up writing a letter to the superintendent, Dr. Jefferson, at the school that he used to go to. And he basically was like, "This guy's a moral disgrace to our society. He is a danger. He's having interracial sex. This is awful." And then blamed the superintendent for releasing Joe and basically just victim blamed Joe. And I don't really know what happened with those boys that did that. I'm assuming nothing really happened to them. But this probation officer was really trying to make out like Joe was this moral danger, and he even said like, "Oh, the neighborhood kids are afraid of him," which is hard to know if they really were because I know that kids sometimes when they see people that are disabled, they don't know how to react to it, and maybe at that time, especially in like the 1920s and 30s, they probably didn't know how to respond to it, but I think he was just like kind of bullshitting. And so he basically sent this letter and like threatened the superintendent and was like, "You need to take him back." And so Joe would basically be sent back to this school for the next few years for his teen years. I think he was there for like 8 years. Joe was bullied and like mistreated and even like beaten horrifically in this school. Like he'd be
Oh my
manipulated.
god.
He would just yeah, he'd just be treated like absolute shit. And the only person that he really ever spoke to was this kitchen lady who was kind of his supervisor because he would do like kitchen cleaning and he would mop and all that. And that was like the only person he really spoke to. During his time, the superintendent even said that Joe would take blame for things that he didn't do. So someone could just be like, "Oh my God, you stole these cigarettes." And Joe would just be like, "Yeah, I did," even though he didn't. And that's a thing that a lot of people who do have like mental disabilities sometimes will are more likely to just agree to things that they didn't do. Overall, he just did not have a good time. His parents actually tried to get him out of this school and they would like send letters and stuff, but they were just like, "No, he has to stay here." So when Joe was 21 in 1936, him and a few of the boys at the school decided they wanted to hop the train and kind of travel between different states. And so they did just that. They traveled between Colorado to Utah all the way to Wyoming. And that's kind of what he did. On August 14th, 1936, there was these two sisters named Dorothy and Barbara Drain. They were sleeping alone in their house and their parents were not home. When one of the sisters woke up to this man who had actually entered into their home. He had actually broken through their front door, but technically I wouldn't say breaking through because the door was unlocked, but regardless, still breaking and entering. This man went on to unfortunately rape Dorothy and would also beat Dorothy and her sister with a hatchet. Unfortunately, Dorothy died, but Barbara was alive, but Barbara was actually put into a coma for like 2 weeks. So when the police arrived, they were like, "We gotta find out who did this." They didn't know who really had done this, but they were trying to find a statement and trying to find witnesses and all that. They did have a brother who was unharmed in another room, but I'm not too sure how old he was, so I don't know if he gave like a description or if he even saw anything. By August 18th, they did have 5 suspects. Police basically said, "We're gonna put out a reward for $1,000, which was like it'd be roughly around $22,000 now for anyone that had any people that they could say did it." And so the only description they really had was this was a man that was tan or like darker skinned. That's all they had, which is like not really giving a whole description at all. One day, it was like August 20th, and this is in Wyoming. There was these 2 detectives who had actually seen this man. He kinda seemed a little out of it, and they were kinda like, "What's going on? He seems like he's kind of high or something." And he was kinda wandering the train tracks, and so they began to talk to him, and this guy was Joe. Now, Joe was homeless. He wasn't anywhere near Colorado. And so they ended up arresting him because he was homeless. So when they brought him in to the jail, he would be questioned by this sheriff named Carroll. Sheriff Carroll, who was Honestly, if I could go back in time, I think I would honestly beat the shit out of this guy. Sheriff Carroll had already known about this widespread search for these suspects in the Drain murder. And when he started talking to Joe, he basically found out Joe had been from Pueblo, Colorado. And he was like, oh, okay. So he starts asking him a lot of questions like, well, Joe, you like the girls pretty, don't you? And saying things like, you probably had several girls in your life. And Joe would just say, yes. And now you need to kind of remember that Dr. Jefferson, who was a superintendent, he said that Joe would just take blame for anything. So just keep that in mind. So Sheriff Carroll asked Joe another question. He's like, if you like girls so much, why do you go and hurt them? Joe would say, according to Sheriff Carroll, well, I didn't mean to, and that he did it out of being mean, and that if they let me go, I'll be good this time. And so after a full 90 minutes, Sheriff Carroll calls up Chief Grady at the Pueblo Police Department and he's like, hey, I got your guy. I'm just going to let you know. And then he goes and tells the press everything. So now everyone thinks Joe is this instigator. So a few hours later, though, Grady actually calls up Carol and he's like, no, like, that doesn't make sense because, like, we already have our prime suspect. He's this 33-year-old guy named Frank. He actually worked with the girl's dad and was recently fired before the attack. So, oh, and also, we found an axe that kind of matched what the wounds had. And we also found a calendar with the date circled on it. Oh, we also found a lot of photos of naked women in his apartment. And we found articles that had sex slaying cut out and taped all over the wallpaper. Oh, and we also found out he was at the funeral and he was acting really fucking weird to the dad. And we actually found fibers under his fingernails that was the same fabric of the bed sheets that the girls were in. So, what do you mean you have our suspect? Like, I think we have the guy. But Carol was like, "No, no, this is the guy." Like he admitted to it. He completely said it and it's him. They were like, "Okay, I guess, like, maybe bring him over." Now, when Joe would kind of was being transported back to Colorado, he would change his story a lot. He would do a lot of reenactments, and he would kinda change up how the murder happened. He would say he did it with a hatchet, then he said he was with a club. When they asked where he had it done, he would give, like, addresses that were where he grew up as a kid or incomplete addresses, and he just kept changing his story. It wasn't so much that he was changing his story like he was lying, it was more so like he didn't know what he was saying, if that makes sense. And, like, Carol kinda just didn't give a fuck. According to Carol, Joe had admitted to being with a man named Frank, and so he was like, "Well, here we go." Now, despite all of these inconsistencies, Sheriff Carroll was never questioned on any of these, which I just think is crazy. Yeah, so on August 28th, Frank had confessed to this crime. He would actually be sent to a really high security prison because people were being racist to him and threatening to do a lot of racist hate crimes. Joe would also be arrested as an accomplice. Joe had apparently identified Frank, saying, "That's Frank." And Frank initially had told the police he had never seen Joe before. But then later, he admitted to Joe being there with him. But then later, actually admitted that the detectives threatened him, saying, if you don't, like, say Joe was there with you, we're gonna kill you, and basically said that there would be a dead Mexican. So that's a little suspicious. And Joe and Frank would do a lie detector. Now, this is back in the 30s. Lie detector tests back then, they were very almost seen like they were from the word of God, and they just kind of believed it. Now, the thing that I thought was so interesting about this is Frank would kind of answer all of these questions and Joe wouldn't. And the people doing the lie detector test were basically like, yeah, we just thought Joe was high on marijuana or something because Joe wasn't answering any of the questions. And I'm sorry, like I just feel like I don't even know if it's like there just wasn't that much education on people with disabilities and like marijuana, of course. But like there you can't be that like
Yeah, like it seems like there's so many inconsistencies in his story. Like, I don't know, I feel like basic detectiveness should be like, "Oh, okay, well, he's saying one thing, um, then why is he gonna say another thing now?" You know?
yeah, and it feels like they just kinda were like, "Oh, who cares? Like, whatever, because this is a disabled man," and they just could get away with it. It honestly was just bullshit is the best way to describe it.
Yeah.
They would go on to sell this, like, narrative that Joe and Frank were these, like, sex deviants and that Joe was with Frank, but Frank had actually planned the attack first, and then he had Joe with him. So then later, Joe had actually been identified as someone who assaulted this woman named Helen after Helen had identified Joe in a newspaper, and Joe actually admitted to this. There was a lot of eyewitnesses that were like, no, that's not true. And actually, when Joe was hopping trains, like when I said in the beginning when the detectives found him, that was because he was actually working in like a train car, working in the kitchen. And he was 170 miles away. And the people working there were like, yeah, there's no way that Joe would have been there unless he's literally the Flash and was able to go there that fast. There's no way. There was just people that were like kind of picking on Joe. There was this other guy where he claimed that Joe was trying to attack him or something, and he claimed, like, Joe had all this money and was like, "Hi, I'm Joseph," but then they were like, "No, like, Joe doesn't refer to himself as Joseph, only Joe, and he's broke, like, he has no money." So, people were just kind of, like, lying, and I don't know if it was just because Joe was mentally disabled and he was easy to use as a scapegoat, or if it was, like, hysteria where people were just believing these things, or if people were trying to get money. I have no idea, but overall, people were just using Joe as, like, a way to just to manipulate him and the system.
Yeah. Like, he's, like, just like a scapegoat there.
Yeah, like, they're just like, "Oh, yeah, I saw him, he did all this." So, yeah, no. The trial is very interesting. They both pled not guilty on October 9th of 1936, and Frank's attorney would try and use what Joe had when being like, "Oh, he's actually mentally disabled," I don't think was true. Joe's attorney would actually try to use the insanity plea to avoid the death penalty, and Sheriff Carroll walks his stupid ass up there, like, 8 times and is like, actually, Joe's mentally fit and he's very aware of his actions, and he actually answered all of the questions right, and he actually showed a lot of remorse, which means he's actually the person who did it. And then Carol even said that Joe claimed he didn't know what sex was, but then also would brag about having sex with those girls. It didn't really make sense because they said despite him saying all this previously, he had actually talked about how Joe was very mentally disabled, although he used a very ableistic term. I'm not gonna repeat, but it was like he was just kinda using a lot of, like he was just lying, literally just bullshitting. And then he also said that he felt like Joe was setting Frank up and that Frank was actually the innocent one and Joe was. But they had 3 psychiatrists there, and they were literally like, "Actually, Joe is the legal definition of what would be insane. He fits the insanity plea. If anything, if he is a part of this crime, he should be in like a mental institution." But the psychiatrist would go on to say, like, Joe struggled to know the difference between right or wrong. He didn't know the difference between a dime and a nickel. And they said his IQ was 46. And the average person for an adult, obviously, it can depend, but it's usually around 90 to 100 for an average person. Joe was 46. He had a mental age of 6 years old. And they were like, would you put a 6-year-old on trial for murder? I don't think so. Despite all of this, the judge was just kind of like, okay, okay, I hear what you're saying. Mm, yeah, I don't really care. So Joe's lawyer asked Frank's lawyer, can you ask Joe a few questions? And I want you to ask him like basic questions that he should know, like who's George Washington, who's like Franklin Roosevelt, and all that. And when Joe was answering these questions, he couldn't. He didn't know who they were. He couldn't tell the difference between a dime and a nickel, like I said. He couldn't recognize his father, who was there, who he hadn't seen in 8 years. He didn't know what a hatchet was, which was the weapon. He didn't even know really who Frank was. He didn't even understand who Dorothy and Barbara were. And
Did he even understand that he was on trial?
no, like, he didn't even understand, like, when they asked him about, like, "You're on trial," he actually just said, "They're talking about me?" Like, he was confused, like, I think he just thought he was answering questions, I don't think he really knew, and this is a thing that a lot of people, like, who are just mentally disabled, like, a lot of studies show, like, they'll just admit to things that they have no part in because it's kind of like when you're a kid and you feel like you need to say yes because an adult is accusing you of something even though you didn't do it. Like, you'll just admit to something because 'cause they're the adult and they know. I wonder if that's kinda the same thing for Joe. Yeah, so Joe's lawyer was literally like, "How come every time the police ask him questions, it's different, but when everyone else asks him questions that isn't from the police, it's completely different. It shows he doesn't actually understand." But the judge was like, "Okay, I don't care." Even though Barbara, who was the sister that survived, was like, "I don't know Joe. Like, I don't recognize Joe, but I recognize Frank." Because Joe was not there. I guess the judge was like, "Yeah, I don't really care." And he sentenced Joe for murder and rape and also sentenced him to death. I just think that is absolutely crazy. Frank would also be sentenced to death and murder, but it's just insane. So the only evidence they truly had of Joe was they found a piece of hair, and this is before DNA matching. So they were like, "Oh, this hair, it looks kind of like his hair." And Joe's Hispanic when Joe wasn't Hispanic. Joe's Syrian. He's Arab. Like, they clearly don't know what they're talking about. And yeah, so they were like, "Yeah, this hair looks kinda like Joe, so yeah, he definitely did it." It literally feels like when you're playing, like, Clue and you're like, "I think Mr. Green did it with the candlestick in the kitchen." Like, it's, like, so stupid. And, like, the 2 detectives, they both were given $1,000 for their part in getting Joe. I just think it was, like, money, like, people were just using it for money. They were like, "Oh, we want this for money." After this trial, one of the things I thought that was really fucked up was the superintendent was also there, and he gave a giant speech on being an advocate for eugenics, saying that people who are mentally disabled should be sterilized and no one under the IQ of 50 should even be allowed to have a family, which is just such a crazy thing. Like, time and place, dude. What are you doing here? Like, you're the superintendent for a school full of mentally disabled people? Like, what the fuck? After this trial, there was this attorney who ended up becoming a general and water commissioner, and he tried to get Joe's case like overturned because he was like, this is crazy. But they were like, no. And Frank would eventually admit to working alone. And that's when he actually admitted to what the detective said about killing him. And so they were like, "Oh, okay, well, we don't care." So this attorney would actually say, "Believe me, if he is gassed, it will take the entire state of Colorado to live it down," which is very true. Frank would end up being convicted of rape and murder of Dorothy and sentenced to death on December 22nd, and he was executed in August of 1937. So, I just kind of wanted to mention that, but the death row part of Joe Ardy. He was on death row for only 21 months. He was treated better and liked by all the inmates and guards. Despite being on a 23-hour lockdown, he was really happy. He would be making funny faces while looking at the metal food trays as like a mirror. He was always just trying to have fun, and he actually really liked it. Warden Roy Best, he had become Joe's biggest supporters, and he tried to save his life multiple times, but unfortunately, it never really happened. He cared for Joe like a son. He'd bring him toys, picture books, crayons. He'd give him like craft paper. He'd bring him homemade snacks. He would just really love Joe. So Joe would actually be interviewed by like journalists. And there was like this article that was posted where Joe was basically informed about his execution date that was going to be after Christmas. But Joe couldn't really see past that, and he just heard like Christmas, and he was so excited for Christmas, and all he wanted was a watch. And so an anonymous listener, or I guess not listener, like reader, saw that and gifted Joe a watch, and Joe loved this watch. He was just so happy for it. One thing I thought that was like really messed up though was there was a petition to get rid of Joe's eyes before he was executed,
What?
which is like, what the fuck? And Joe was just like, "No, you're not gonna kill me, and I need my eyes." So Joe just like again still truly didn't understand that he was going to die. He was asked like multiple times, and like 4 different times he would just say, "No, I'm not going to die. Joe's not going to die." Christmas Day, 1938, Joe received his battery operated toy train by Warden Best as a Christmas present. And he loved this toy train. He absolutely loved it. He would roll it between the metal bars and roll it to the other cellmates, and they would roll it back with him, and they would play with him with this. All the other guards and inmates kind of looked at Joe like a friend, but I think they also looked at him like he was almost like their younger brother. Like, these are guys that are on death row. Like, these are your hardcore criminals. And they're playing with a toy train. And I just think it's almost like a precious image in a way, like thinking of that. Like, they really just cared for Joe. And Joe was asked if he wanted to leave. And he said, "No, I want to have a life sentence and stay with Warden Best. At home,
Oh,
the kids used to beat me, and I never get into trouble here," which I thought was so sad. This was the first time he actually was treated with so much love. The warden would say Joe was the happiest man on death row, and he would also say he probably doesn't even know he's about to die, but all he did was sit happy and play with that toy train I had given him. So Joe would ask for his execution day if he could have ice cream for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. He would get just that. He was to be executed on January 6th, 1939, and when he was questioned on this, he still, again, just didn't understand any of it. He didn't really get it. I don't think he knew what death was. So the other inmates would try to explain to him what's going to happen, but even then, he didn't know. The day before his execution day, the warden convinced Joe to leave his train with a fellow inmate, and Joe was really heartbroken. He didn't want to do it, but he played with this inmate, and they played for a few hours, and then Joe was able to give him his toy train for a bit. The morning of his day, his execution day, his family had come over to see him, and Joe was noted to not really show any emotion. He was kind of flat affect in a way. He only saw his mom and his sister, his aunt, and his cousin, but his dad had actually died, and Joe wasn't able to go to his funeral because he was in jail. And the warden Best actually arranged him to see his family, and I think they weren't even gonna let him see his family, which I think is fucked up. And he kinda didn't really show any attachment to his mom, even when she was crying, but he did get really happy when fellow inmates brought a 3-gallon pint of ice cream for the family to eat, and he got really excited because he loved ice cream. When the death warrant was read to Joe by Warden Best, he asked if Joe understood, and Joe just said very calmly, "They are killing me," before he got up and left his prison block. He shook hands with all the other inmates as he said goodbye, and one inmate said, "Keep your chin up, Joe. We'll be with you soon." He had a bowl of ice cream for his last meal, which he didn't even get to finish, and he asked if they could refrigerate his ice cream so he could have it later. He became really heartbroken when they took his toy train away, but then he just said, "Can you just give it to Angie's," who was another inmate that he really loved. The warden Best would walk with Joe to the gas chamber, and while passing the prison chicken coop, Warden asked Joe if he wanted to still raise hens in heaven because Joe really loved hens, and Joe just said, "No, I think I want to play the harp." He smiled his entire way into the chamber, but his smile actually faded when he was blindfolded. He got really, really scared. He didn't know what was going on. And so Warden Best held Joe's hand really, really tight. And then his smile returned. He felt safe again. When the warden went back and had to leave the gas chamber, he was reported weeping during the entire thing, begging them and begging them, "Isn't there something we can do?" He tried everything he could, but his cries were just dismissed, and Joe would die smiling. Joe smiled his entire time until he lost consciousness after 3 breaths. Joe was declared dead at 8:19 p.m., January 6, 1939. He was the 7th prisoner who was executed by the gas chamber. Sheriff Carroll, he was known as one of the best peace officers for his entire career, which is, I just think, crazy. He actually was arrested later that year in November 15th in 1939, and he was arrested for assaulting a waitress, and he was sent to jail for 6 months and with $100 fine. But then he was let off for good behavior, which is like, I'm sorry, what? Good behavior? I'm sorry, you guys killed an innocent disabled man, but this guy actually assaults someone and he gets off. And Sheriff Carroll would actually stay a sheriff until 1961 at the age of 81. And so, yeah, he just continued doing what he did. No repercussions or anything. It would take decades later until people actually started to bring awareness to it. There were books written and there were poems written, and it kind of was talked about, but no one really cared until around like 2006. There was the Arc of the Pikes Peak region, which was basically this home base for people who had worked on the case and were close to the people on the case and were huge advocates for Joe. They really wanted to bring awareness to what happened to Joe. And the executive director, Teddy Roberts, and her staff members had opened their arms to the handful of people who really cared to what happened to Joe. And actually, they would create a lot of funding and support for this. And in 2007, they actually turned this group into the Friends of Joe Arridy. This was basically a little passion project that they wanted to create to just have memory of Joe and what happened to him. In 2008, they were able to replace the rusty motorcycle plate and make a beautiful tombstone for Joe so he'd be remembered and actually have people remember him. So during the ceremony, there was this attorney named David Martinez, and he was so moved by this that he actually asked them to send all of the files and everything back to his office in Denver, and he was going to create a petition to ask the governor to pardon Joe because he was just so moved by this and he wanted to pick up this case. And in 2008, another attorney named Anne, and I'm so sorry, I'm probably going to say your name wrong, but it's Anne Tremanis. I don't know how to say it. I don't know if it's like French or not. I'm so sorry. She is a lawyer who she works on cases in justice towards people with disabilities and their families, and she's a huge advocate for that. And so she actually created the website Friends of Joe Arridy, and she used a lot of her own resources to bring more news and just information to around Joe. Now, I'm not too sure how active Friends of Joe Arridy site is. I've been on it. I've tried to look at some of the pictures and stuff, but I haven't seen too much. I couldn't really see any pictures, so I don't know if that was something on my end or if they just haven't been able to update it. But it's still active and has a lot of information, so it's really good to check out. In 2010, attorney David Martinez, he had written over a 500-page pardon application for Joe, which was written 72 years to the day of Joe's death. 72 years. That is crazy. And in 2011, Governor Bill Ritter, who was a former district attorney in Denver, he pardoned Joe. So Joe was finally pardoned. He had said, "Pardoning Joe Arridy cannot undo this tragic event in Colorado history. It is in the best interest of justice and simple decency, however, to restore his good name." His tombstone then had the words, "Here lies an innocent man." And people still go to his grave and, place flowers and just kind of bring awareness to Joe and just kind of remember who Joe was. I just think that's really beautiful. I want to end this episode by just reading a little quote from their site. "On death row, both inmates and guards were more kinder than ever before. Therefore, he trusted them. He really trusted them. That's why he gave up raising chickens for playing a harp. That's why he was indeed the happiest man on death row. That's why he died smiling." And that is the episode. I'm curious to hear everyone's thoughts on this. If you know someone who worked on this case, or maybe you live in the area of where this happened, or if this is your first time hearing it, what are your thoughts? And I'm very curious to hear what anyone thinks if you are part of the disabled community. I'm very curious. It's very important that we remember this story and know what happened and just bring awareness to it so that things like this don't happen anymore. But that's the episode, and we'll see you guys in the next one.